Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first keynote, ESA Global keynote, the North American keynote. So I'm very pleased to introduce Rachel Kranton, who's our speaker. Rachel is the James Duke Professor of Economics. She's also currently the Dean of Social Sciences at Duke's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. Rachel has many accolades and accomplishments. I'm going to sample a few. So she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the Econometric Society. Rachel completed her PhD at Berkeley in '93 and has been a prolific and influential economist across a lot of different domains, but roughly on how institutions and social settings affect economic outcomes. So her research contributes to microeconomics, development, and IO. I'm going to single out two fields. One is the theories of networks. So, influential papers include, strategic interactions in networks, public goods in networks. So these are all theoretical contributions. But sort of dear to my heart and very influential in the experimental community is her work on social identity. So she introduced identity into economic thinking. If we think about the economics of identity, and now lots of people just say identity economics, Akerlof and Kranton's 2000 QJE paper is the starting point. So Rachel's work in identity economics showed creativity, breadth, and depth in the sense that she initially started with theoretical developments and then applied it to many different areas of economics. And her more recent work also featured experiments. So in addition to the earlier theoretical work and her book, her 2010 book on identity economics, which many people are familiar with, she also has two recent papers that I want to highlight. One is her 2020 PNAS paper on deconstructing bias in social preferences, reveals groupie and non-groupie behavior, and a newer paper in 2021. I think the title is very revealing, which is Oversampling of Minority Categories Drives Misperceptions of Group Compositions. I also want to mention just very quickly that in addition to all the scholarly work, she also pioneered a new research network called the Economic Research on Identity Norms and Narratives, or shortened as ERIN. And I want to advertise that ERIN opened up its submissions to the entire world about a year ago, and it will continue to be open. And I also noticed that in this ESA global meeting, there are at least 2 sessions on identity. So without further ado, let's welcome Rachel.
Well, thank you so much for the incredibly generous introduction. So this is a special pleasure to presenting this work with Yan as my introducer and as chairing the session, because of course, none of this work would be done without her. So it's Yan's work in published in 2009 that inspired me to actually say, wow, this might be possible to study identity economics. So Yan and Sherry Lee were the first to really dig into the experimental work on identity per se, and really marrying social psychology and economic methods, which has been a fantastic, first of all, fantastic contribution, but also fantastic inspiration to me, and I'm sure to many of you who are here today. So you'll be seeing, your paper reference there. It's really the foundation. So in fact, deconstructing experimental findings of group bias is exactly that, is looking at Yan's work and other folks' work, and saying, why aren't we seeing what we see out there in the world? So the jumping off point, the jumping off point for my endeavor, my experimental endeavor, I mean, it's a bit grandiose, but it's true. I'm very disturbed and want to understand why group conflict has been a constant feature of human history. So groups are defined on religion, race, nationality, and culture. And these group conflicts have been horrific in forcibly extracting labor and resources from others. We know that country and regional borders lead to civil wars. There's also battles over identity itself. This is just an example, some pictographs about the American Civil War, which is one of the most destructive wars in the United States history. And, I'm giving you these very, very heavy examples, but we also know that group conflict appears in perhaps more trivial areas, but I don't know if they're trivial or not trivial. People aren't dying yet, I guess. But anyway, obviously sports rivalries are sort of mimicking this overall picture I have of group conflict. And I probably should have a picture of some European soccer teams national soccer teams, given that we're in the middle of the Euro football tournament. And of course, some of these conflicts aren't settled. That's a little photo of South Carolina just a couple of years ago. And I may return to these folks if I have time through the talk. So this overall has been a big reason why I'm studying identity, right? Because I want to understand what drives people to act in this way. Now, of course, I'm not the only person who wants to understand this. And so there's a long experimental tradition in sociology and social psychology, and I'll review some of the classics a little bit later. But basically what the experimental method is probably a lot of you know, is the participants are divided into groups. And overall, there's this in-group bias, which is a rather robust finding in the sociology literature. And then we have Jan's work, which married this social psychology experiment with economics. And a key feature, of course, is that the tasks were incentivized. So people, it mattered to an own individual's payoffs, what they did to, how they allocated income to other people. So it wasn't only income to other people, it was income to self and other people. And Jan and Sherry were measuring social preferences. And what they found is an in-group bias. So comparing social preferences towards in-groups versus social preferences towards out-groups, there is indeed a bias in that participants were more inequity averse towards in-groups. So they were also inequity averse towards the out-group, but they were more inequity averse towards the in-group. And so this is a stunning paper that marries social psychology and economics, like I said, and has a very strong result. But if you look at the result, you wonder, where is all of that destructive behavior that we see out there in the world, right? So all those horrific pictures, which I just showed you, where do we see the actual destructive behavior? And of course, the key is that the results, and as in most experimental results, are based on average results, as opposed to trying to break down the average and look at individual behavior. So I embarked on this research agenda to look behind this average, on this search for this destructive behavior. I mean, I was thinking, well, one hypothesis, of course, was our lab environments in American universities are simply too pallid to actually have people engage in destructive behavior. Maybe it's just, this is not something that we would be able to see in our labs, right? But I wanted to know, is this something that is only something we see in these grand historical moments, or is it something we also see in the lab? And of course, there were some hints in some other papers out there that do see this kind of joy of destruction game. You may have seen that, but I wanted to see this if there was something in a group setting. So questions are, can we observe group-based bias or destructive behavior in the lab? And if so if we see it, can we then experimentally understand what is increasing this bias and what decreases the bias, right? So this is the agenda. If we can somehow in a very controlled way see the bias, then we can also ask what's making it happen? What's the mechanism possibly, and what are possibly some solutions? So that was sort of the agenda. As you'll see, my initial hypothesis was wrong, but let me go on with my story here. So the objective is to deconstruct this average bias. And so what I'm going to try and do today is give you findings from 4 different studies with the group manipulation. 3 of them are mine, and one of them is Mikal. I saw him. He was one of the people on my 4 little screens, but he's gone now. Mikhail Bauer and co-authors, right, as sort of an advertisement for that work. I should also think is really stunning work. But I think overall we have a research agenda here. It's not just my work. I think we're all working on this now and trying to understand this sort of deep animosities that can occur between groups, especially as the societies in which we live seem to be increasingly polarized. So I'm going to first describe 3 different income allocation experiments, which are experiments that I did with some co-authors. And then if I have time, I will tell you about this 4th one, which is about a joy of destruction game, but it's not my experiment, but I want to sort of advertise it and have it part of this whole question. So the research question, the hypothesis was, or the guess, was that somehow the lab experiments were too pallid. And we know that the minimal group paradigm, which I'll review in a minute, I was thinking maybe it's not strong enough. So somehow I wanted to see, well, maybe the people who are more strongly identified with the group, they're the ones who have the bias, right? So you had to sort of think about that people were on a spectrum. There are some people who were identified with a group and some people who identified less with the group. And the people who really identify the group, the people who are the diehard football fans, they're the ones who might be more biased, or the equivalent of that. So I set out to construct an experiment where we could identify somebody who was more or less strongly identified with the group. And the answer is no, that isn't what happened, at least in our data. And now it's been replicated twice. The first experiment was replicated twice. Rather, what we see is that there are what we call groupie and non-groupie individuals. So what we found is that some people have no in-group bias. They seem to act the same way towards everyone, no matter whether that person is in their group or out of their group. And some people have a strong in-group bias, and actually in a subset of them are destructive. So I found the destructive behavior, right? It is there, right? And now, of course, if you put these people together and you do an average, then you get the average. In fact, we replicated, I think, beautifully, Yan's results. I mean, to the T, we replicated her results. So which gives me confidence that that in some sense we're onto something, that we can overall see these biases, and yet if we sort of quote unquote deconstruct them, you can see how that actually, when you look at the deconstructed pieces, that gets us back to the average, right? So we have a replication as well as a sort of a deconstruction of what's going on there. And so then this leads us to the question, is there's a possible tendency for in-group bias possibly to be an individual trait, which then gets us to this question of, well, what do we do about it if that's the case? So that's the first experiment I'd like to tell you about. I'm just repeating it up here on the slide. That's experiment number 1. Experiment number 2 is sort of as a replication and a investigation. So if that is the case, that there is indeed these groupie and non-groupie people, can we see it again if we were to do it again? And what are the correlates? And are we seeing the same correlates? So are we seeing the same correlates in experiment 1 as we see in experiment 2? And the answer is yes, and I'll show you that. So this is a United States context with United States participants generally, and we see that the not groupie subjects tend to be politically independent in the American political spectrum. So that's their in the lab behavior correlates with out of the lab behavior in actually a way that makes sense, right? These are people who decide not to be a political party member. So I'll talk about that. And the third investigation that I'd like to tell you about is, again, a very similar kind of task. We're sticking with the same income allocation tasks, and we're now adding another twist. So if indeed there is this groupie or not groupie behavior, and if indeed we now see that there are individuals who are acting destructively, how can we quote unquote solve it? Or what are some things that might dampen this particular kind of behavior? And so in a third experiment, myself and co-authors looked at the possibility of providing what's called humanizing information. So information about the subjects that kind of breaks the group attachment. And I'll show you how we did that. And the answer is yes, indeed, if you provide what's humanizing information, you will indeed have less bias. And interestingly enough, the bias is being reduced from 2 sides. There is there's overall less allocation to the in-group and more allocation to the out-group. So you're kind of breaking the in-group attachment as well as breaking the out-group animosity. And so then the gap shrinks, but it's just shrinking from two directions. So that's a ambitious agenda for the talk, but I hope to get through it. And then if I have time, I'd like to tell you about not my work, but Mikhail's and their team's work on the joy of destruction experiment, if I'm able to get that far. Okay, so what I'd like to do, because of course we all, I actually think it's important to understand the history of the intellectual history of the experiments that we're running. So I just wanted to make sure we're all on the same page about the intellectual history of this whole set of experiments. And I also think it's really important to understand I'm obviously not the only one to think it's important to understand who our subjects are and how we're recruiting them. And are we really indeed, measuring something that is generalizable or not? And so I just want to give you a sense of the intellectual tradition behind this set of experiments. And so one of the first experiments is in social psychology. It's called the Robbers Cave experiment. And it was conducted, these are some of the boys who were involved in the Robbers Cave experiment. I don't know whether they signed, their parents allowed their pictures to be used. It was done in 1954. In any case, this is now public use picture. And these, importantly, I think, or maybe not, it's a question, these were, boys of that age. This is like 10, 11, 12-year-old boys. They were put in a summer camp in Robbers Cave. It's a state park in Oklahoma in the United States. And the finding is that these boys who were kept apart for 2 weeks in separate parts of this state park, when they were brought together to do games like swimming and archery and camp games. This competition among the groups created a large amount of animosity, and they created flags and insulted each other and so on. So this is a very extreme version of, you create these groups and you get animosity. On the other side of the spectrum, in terms of, intervention, experimental intervention, is the minimal group social and identity theory experiments. This is by Todgeville and Turner. And they went to the opposite extreme. And rather than bring people out to a summer camp and have them spend 2 weeks there, they did something minimal. That's the idea here for the word behind minimal. But it was, again, with a similar population. It was the same age boys. Okay, just saying, that was the population. And the now famous minimal group paradigm used paintings by Clay and Kandinsky, asked the participants to state their preferences, and then actually randomly assign them to groups, and then presented them with matrices where the boys picked allocations on these matrices. And importantly, the allocation did not involve the decision maker. The allocation involved the points for somebody who is out of their group and somebody who is in their group, but it did not involve their own points. And the finding here, that's right, participants allocate to others in their own and the other group. And these experiments largely also generated this in-group bias. Though when you looking back and reading this, there was a recognition that there was actually this heterogeneity among the behavior, but it didn't explore it in a very particularly systematic way. Then we come to Yan and Sherry's work. So minimal groups and social preferences. And what they did, as I mentioned in the introduction, is they married this social psychology tradition with the economics tradition. So it's marrying the minimal group paradigm with the Charnes and Rabin social preferences matrices and the income allocation tasks. So in these experiments, the participants are allocating money between themselves and an in-group participant or an out-group participant. And so, of course, this is key that an individual's own payoffs were at stake when they were making this allocation decision. So when I was choosing money for somebody else, that also had implications for my own payoffs. So a participant's own money was at stake. And the researchers, Yan and Sherry, they estimated the parameters of a utility function. So the utility function that we know and love, the social preferences utility functions. Here's an example of it. And the finding, as I mentioned before, is that overall individuals are inequality averse, but there is a distinct difference between the level and you can even get deeper into the type of inequality aversion, whether it's advantageous or disadvantageous inequality aversion. But there's a distinct difference for the in-group rather than the out-group. Okay, so we built directly on this model, or this model that Jan and Sherry laid out for us. Again, our investigation was to say, okay, so there is this difference, and it's really striking to see this difference in an economic lab, but where's the destructive behavior? Can we create an environment in a place like Duke University lab, which is what we had available to us, where we see this destructive behavior? So what we did is we created two conditions. We had the minimal group condition, and we also had a political group condition. And a key difference, a key departure from the previous literature is that we have a within subject design. So we're able to see the same person in the minimal group setting and in the political group setting. That turns out it's obviously going to be key. Basically, we just gathered a lot more information about our subjects. So it's somehow not mysterious. It's just we just went out and we just gathered a lot more information about each individual's choices. I should say we were also adopting the methods of neuropsychology. So we were really had, they make lots of choices and a lot of small choices, which also made me think, oh my gosh, what are we going to pick up with this? But again, remarkably, we see very, very, very consistent patterns, and that we've now replicated twice. And again, as I mentioned, the research design was that we wanted to see if we could have individuals who more or less identified with their assigned group. And the hypothesis is that the people who identified more with their assigned group maybe those are the ones who are exhibiting this destructive behavior. If we can only pick them up, we can possibly see that. And again, we do replicate to the T, the in-group bias that Jan and Sherry had. I'm sure it's in their data too. There's a large heterogeneity, and that we were able to estimate. And that's where we come to our conclusion that there's groupie versus not groupie individuals. So let me give you a sense of the details. So as I was telling you who the subjects were in the social psychology experiments, you should know who our subjects were. Our subjects were Duke University, mostly students, not all. There were also some graduate, there were also some community members. This is what Duke really looks like pre-COVID. I think it'll look like this again in the fall. Lots of students out and about. It's warm, it's sunny, it's just very, collegiate looking place. These are the students at a basketball game. Okay, speaking of groupiness. So, I think, so I put this up here. It's a little bit of fun, but it's also, there's something serious going on at universities in terms of identity building as well that I'm not sure we've completely studied. I'm sure we haven't studied well. So here are the students at a basketball game. And of course, I don't know if these are the students who were in my lab, but just to give you a sense of the setting. Okay. All right, so the experimental session went as follows. There's some instructions. We had an asocial control, so subjects were not divided into groups. Then we had a minimal group or political group treatment. The order of these was randomized. In each of the group treatments, the participants took a survey, and that survey then divided them into two groups. So in the minimal group is just actually our minimal group is actually enhanced. Which should say that's an important detail. We had both the Clay and Kandinsky pictures, but we also had landscape images, and we also had poetry, lines of Shakespeare, actually. And we did that, again, because we were thinking that the lab environment, again, was relatively pallid. So we kind of just wanted to make this minimal group setting somehow more meaningful. And it's not, but you'll see that we got exactly the same results in the minimal group treatment that Jan and Sherry did. And then the political group treatment asked a political survey, and I'll show you some examples of that. And then we have this interesting post-experiment survey. I mean, it's sort of standard one, but it turns out to give us some information. Okay, and of course, standard, they were paid for one choice in each of the sections of the experiment that they were making a choice. And again, this is a within subject design. Let me give you a sense of the political group treatment. In the political group treatment, the participants were asked to self-identify as Democrat, Republican, Independent, or none of the above. If a participant answered Independent or none of the above, they were then asked a subsequent question if they were closer to the Democrats or closer to the Republicans. We then created two groups. One was called the Democrat group, and one was called the Republican group. And in the Democrat group, there were two kinds of people: the people who answered Democrat, and the people who answered independent or none of the above, but said they were closer to the Democrats. And similar for the Republicans, had actual Republicans and people who leaned Republican. So we're calling Democratic leaning independents and Republican leaning independents. And so this is the design. The design was to see if there was a difference between the Democrats and the independents who lean Democrats, because arguably the Democrats are more strongly attuned to the Democrat group. And same thing for the Republicans to their group versus the folks who were independents. And so the idea was to compare the Democrats and the Democratic leaning independents. Oh, sorry, and also to compare the Republicans and the Republican leaning independents. In the end, we've did all of the comparisons, but we don't have enough power in the Republicans and Republican leaning independents to really come to any particular conclusions, because there simply weren't enough of these folks in our sample. But we do have the comparison between Democrats and Democratic leaning independents. I also mentioned that because, again, we have to be careful what our subject pools are, right? So we had a particular subject pool. So that's why we also did a national sample, to try and make sure that this wasn't just a Democrat phenomenon or left of the political spectrum phenomenon. So we then did a national sample, and I will tell you about that as our sort of second study. Okay, but to the main stream of this particular study, that's the idea. Okay, so we thought, okay, we've got these really strong political partisans. They're the ones who in the political group are going to make, sort of be this particularly destructive behavior. And okay, well, let's see what happened. Oh, before you see what happened, maybe I can tell you what they actually did. Sorry, I'll give you a little sense of what the screens looked like. And this is how fast the task went by. So really, they had about 2 seconds up to 10 seconds. And this is sort of, again, borrowing the methods from neuroeconomics. So that's how fast everything went by. There were 26 total matrices. So when we run through the entire experiment, we had 208 decisions per subject. So it's a lot of information about each person, which is why we are able to make our conclusions. And anything that you would think should be randomized here was. Okay. So what these matrices were doing when a subject made a choice on a matrix, they were making a decision, and those decisions could be categorized in terms of these social preferences, which I will show you a little bit later. But for example, if the subject here chose the bottom row, they were giving up 20 for an overall gain in surplus. So the subject that chose 20 was overall reducing the inequality between herself and the other person, and also raising the overall payoffs. The own label here is indicating that this person was in their own group. Other, if it said other, then the person to whom they were allocating the money was somebody in the other group. This particular choice, if the person chose the bottom row, they were giving up 20 to make the other person go down by 80. So this is this dominant seeking, inequity loving. Eventually, we just called it destructive behavior. And that's the type of behavior that we were saying, where is it? We were wondering where it is out there, and was it related to a group distinction? Okay, so let's get the results. So the first result is just taking a look at the income allocation decisions. Let's take a look at an individual I in condition G for a given matrix M. Okay, so condition G here is either the minimal group condition or the political condition. And we take a look at the individual, the decision maker saw the same matrix twice. Saw this same decision matrix when the recipient was in their own group, and saw exactly the same matrix when the recipient was in the other group. And the question is, when facing that matrix, was there a difference between the choice that the participant made? For example, did the participant, when allocating income and the recipient was in their own group, choose the top row, in which case the own group member got 100. But when the same matrix appeared, did the participant choose the bottom row, in which case the other participant got 20. Okay, so this is a measure. We just have 26 matrices where we just look at that difference between what the recipients received, whether they're in the own group or the other group. And then we average across those 26 matrices, we have a favoritism measure for individual I in a particular group condition. And then we have two numbers for each person. We have I's favoritism in the minimal group condition and I's favoritism in the political group condition. Okay, so now we have data on each person. We have two numbers for each person. And now what we're doing to do is look at those numbers and compare them as I was, well, actually it's the distribution of those numbers, right? So it's the distribution of those numbers and compare them for the subsets of our population. Okay, so this is the favoritism measure. And overall, if we look at in the political group, and overall, if we look at that favoritism measure, we do see that there is favoritism towards the in group. This is the mean favoritism level, but we can, and this is the median here. That's the interquartile range. And look, we start to see, we see there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? There's a big distribution here, right? Now we take a look at the that's just a hint of what's coming up. So then we take a hint, let's take a look at the Democrats. So the Democrats have a high favoritism, and this is the median. And here's the Democratic leaning independents. And they also seem to have an in-group favoritism, but they're on average, it's lower than the Democrats. So we said, oh, this was our hypothesis. You know, the Democrats are acting in a more biased way in the political group than those Democratic leaning independents. And if we compare those means, we do see the mean is significantly different. So, wow, okay, so that's our hypothesis. We've got evidence for hypothesis. But as you all know, research doesn't always go that way. And we have something else to look at. And here I've got to move you guys so I can see my screen. Okay. Here we're looking at the minimal group treatment. We still see a bias, an in-group bias or in-group favoritism here, positive in-group favoritism overall. And the Democrats have positive in-group favoritism, and the Democratic leaning independents actually don't. So Democratic leaning independents show no favoritism in the minimal group treatment. But there's still this gap between the two of these here, right? And I can't, now I've got to move you guys back so I can't see what's on my screen. All right, there we go. And if we look at the difference in the minimal group between Democrats and Democratic independents, there is a difference, right? And that's strange. Why in the minimal group treatment, which has nothing to do with politics, are the Democrats acting in this more biased way towards out-group people than the Democratic leaning independents? There should be no reason, right? It's a minimal group treatment. It has nothing to do with politics. Okay, so we have a hint that there's something else going on here. And then we look at the difference in differences. If I can make my cursor go, there we go. The difference in differences is 0. Meaning that the Democrats are acting in a more biased way than the Democratic leaning independents in both group treatments. So politics just raised the overall level, but didn't change the difference. Okay, so this is evidence against our hypothesis, right? Okay, so then we said, well, we've got to figure out what's going on here. And so what we did is we started looking at the individuals overall. And to give you a sense of what we were doing, is the question essentially is, okay, I can do it best on here. This is everybody, right? This is the entire subject pool. The question is, are these folks, these little dots up here, who have very high favoritism in the political group treatment, are they the same people that have the high dots over here? Are these the same folks? Right? That's the question. So are the people who are acting in a biased way in the political group treatment, are they also acting in a biased way in the minimal group treatment? So pictorially, are these people the same as these people? Obviously, these plots can't tell us. So we did this plot, which is coming next. Okay, so now what we've done is we've plotted each individual's favoritism level in the political treatment and the minimal group treatment. So political treatment and minimal group treatment. And here we're starting to see, yes, they are perhaps the same people. So here are the people that were clustered around 0, and we're going to start calling these people not groupy. These people have no favoritism in either group treatment. So that means when they saw those matrices, they essentially weren't making any difference in their choices, whether it said own on the top or other on the top. Whereas these folks were making a distinction. And they have a lot of favoritism in both group treatments. And so we're starting to get this idea of calling these people groupy. Okay. So the next step was to then to do the exercise of estimating social preferences. And we simply followed the literature here, which had been laid out so beautifully for us, up until the point we started doing the individual measures. So just to make sure to fix ideas in terms of the vocabulary, if we normalize our matrix so that the top row gives weakly more to the decision maker, choosing the bottom row, the decision maker suffers a loss. And they're suffering a loss perhaps for a social objective. Now, of course, if you don't choose the bottom row, you choose the top row, then you're just choosing money for yourself, so you call you selfish. If you choose the bottom, you're losing money, and there could be the social objective of less inequality. So somebody would be inequality averse. Maximizing total income, so you choose the bottom row so that the overall income is higher. Or there's this other social objective, which is this dominance seeking, is that dominance seeking, you're giving up money, the subject is giving up money in order to make the difference between their money and the other subject higher, right? So you want to just create a greater gap between the money you have and the money somebody else has. And the estimation of this utility, this is the standard social preferences utility function. So we have beta is the weight on own income, rho is the weight on advantageous inequality when you're making more than the other person, and sigma is the sigma is the parameter on utility parameter on disadvantageous inequality. And then when you estimate these parameters, then you can, sort of just take a look at the signs, and then you get these labels, right? So if beta is positive and sigma is negative, and rho is negative and sigma is negative, then we can call that person inequity averse. And that's the results. Sort of, if you look at subjects on average, we do see this inequity aversion, and that arrow is just to sort of indicate that there's a difference within that box when we're looking at in-group versus out-group recipients. So we did exactly that. We estimated the parameters of that utility function in exactly a standard way. And the first thing we did is see, are we going to get the same results as Jan and Sherry did? And the answer is yes, we exactly replicate their results. So then we wanted to look at the individuals. And so the way we did that is we used a mixing model, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, or sometimes called a latent class model. And what the latent class model posits that there's a particular number of types of individuals in the population, so utility types. And then you estimate the utility function parameters for those types. We estimated 4 types. That was just enough to give us to be able to span the space that we wanted to span. We could have done 5. We could have done 10. At one point, we did that, and we even used some model selection criteria. But we stuck in the end with 4 because that seemed to give us the easiest interpretation of what we saw in the data. But to say there's lots of choices here. And it is key to know that we did not say that one of the types had to be dominant seeking and one of the types had to be selfish. It's the data that gave the parameters of the types and the percentage of the population of each type. And then we looked at the parameters and their signs, and then we gave it a name according to that box that I had earlier. Okay, so once we had the types, that wasn't it, right? We had to make sure, we had to then say each individual had to be of a type. And to do that, we looked at each individual's behavior in each treatment and pairing, and using the estimated parameters, we asked what's the probability that an individual is of type T. Okay, so sort of an ex post calculation. And then we assigned each individual to a type in each treatment for each pairing. So the first question that you should be asking is, that's crazy. It could be that this highest posterior probability was 55%. So 55% they were type T and 45% they were another type. And so what's your categorization? It means nothing. Well, it turns out that 95% of our subjects were extraordinarily well type specified. So we had a 90, these weren't probabilities of 50, 55, and 45, they were probabilities of 95 and 5. And that actually is very consistent with the whole social preferences literature out there, is that people seem to, their social preference types, their behavior is very consistent with particular kinds of rule, you might even say rules. They're trying to do something. Either they're just being selfish, or they're being inequity averse, or they're being dominant seeking. And the type specifications, again, this is in the social preference literature that doesn't have groups in it, are extraordinarily well defined. And they were in our case as well. So then we're not quite done yet. To identify groupie and non-groupie people, we said, well, okay, the not groupie people essentially have the same utility type, whether they were dealing with an own subject or an other subject. And the groupie people had a different utility type, whether they were looking at their own, whether they were giving money to their own group or into the other group. And then, so that's, it turns out it's essentially a crosstab. So let me give you a sense of how that works. So this is the minimal group treatment. And basically we were able to just put people in one of these 16 boxes, because these were our utility types. And the people are on the diagonal have the same social preference type, whether they're facing an in-group recipient or an out-group recipient. So the people on the diagonal are not groupie. They're not changing. They have exactly the same utility function type, no matter who, whether it's in-group or out-group recipient. The people off the diagonal are the people we call groupie. So the people I circled here, right, they are inequity averse towards their own group, but they are dominant seeking towards their out group. And again, another reason I circled it is these are the people I was looking for. It's like, where were these people? Well, there they are. I've got folks that are acting in a very destructive way towards the out group. About 34% of subjects are strongly not groupie, and 17% of our subjects are strongly groupie. This is when you look over both treatments, the minimal group and the political group. So 34% of subjects never change their utility function type, and 17% are changing it consistently. All right, so maybe, I hope I've convinced you that we have subjects who react to groups and subjects who don't react to groups. Now, if I've convinced you of that, let's take a look at what do we see any correlates with that? One of the first things we can tell you is that there's a time difference between how fast these subjects made their decisions. So what I've got here is I'm mapping here the not groupie subjects and the groupie subjects, and not groupie subjects are making their decisions overall more quickly. Now, of course, we don't know what's going on in people's heads, but an interpretation is that a not groupie person is simply not paying attention to the label own and other on top of these matrices. They're just making their choices, and they're not even attending to own and other. Now, I don't know if that's true. Next thing to do is do an eye tracking study, right? Absolutely. We should understand what they're looking at on the screen. We haven't done that yet. That's the next one of the things that we want to do. But it looks like they're not attending, meaning they're not, to that difference, and they're making their decisions faster than groupie subjects who have to decide, okay, it's now flipped, it's an own versus an other, and I've got to make a different decision than I would have made otherwise. So the time response data is telling us that there's a difference, at least in the way these subjects are behaving in the lab. What about out of the lab? This is from our demographic survey that we took at the end. And these are the only demographics that we tested. And indeed, we found nothing in terms of female. Everyone asks me, are these women, or these are the men? No, there's no difference. There's no gender difference. It doesn't seem to be an ethnicity difference. The differences we have, and this is going to come up in our replication, is that the folks that are not groupie have a greater tendency, to be politically independent. So again, outside the lab, these are people who have exactly the same political opinions as their counterparts who are in the political party, but they're not in the political party. So they've chosen not to be in that group. So we think that that's consistent with this idea of groupiness. And we do have this interesting effect of a father with an advanced degree, which I don't have a lot of time to talk about, except it could either be income or education. And it's intriguing, but we don't really, again, more to do. Okay, so this was our wonderful, Duke University sample. And I showed you the kids on the campus and I showed you them at basketball games. Is this replicable? Do we see this other populations? And the answer is yes.
Excuse me.
And one of the things we wanted to do, do I have to stop?
No, 5 minutes. So we can have 10 minutes for Q&A.
I'm sorry. I have 5 minutes and then I have 10 minutes for Q&A. Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here we wanted to capture the possibility that we wanted to make sure we had more, at least, of a political representation. And so we did an MTurk study, and there we actually didn't do the political group treatment. We just did the minimal group treatment. And our questions were, what correlates with the groupie and not groupie distinction? Whereas the distinction here of groupie, not groupie is that just that one crosstab, right? Because we only saw them in one group treatment. So just that one crosstab, who was on the diagonal and who was off the diagonal in terms of their social preference types. And the correlates we were looking for were personality measures and demographics, including political party affiliations and possibly the location, because we had their IP addresses. So what do we find? Personality measures do not seem to relate to groupie or not groupie behavior. Basic demographics, again, female, age, ethnicities don't seem to relate to groupie versus not groupie behavior. Education level, no. Religious service attendance, no. But here we see this political affiliation coming up again. And what I mean here by political affiliation is the people that are saying they're not in a political party. Okay, that correlates with groupie, sort of not groupie behavior. Overall, what about political parties? We don't see it across the entire United States if we test not the Deep South, but when we get to the Deep South, I have to say we had to oversample the Deep South because MTurk is not a particularly, as we know, right? It's not necessarily representative. We do see that that groupiness, if I can create that adjective, does seem to be somewhat suggestive that is correlated with if a Southern Republican, so that a Republican living in the Deep South, rather than independents. I guess we're comparing Republicans to independents living in the Deep South. Okay, so that's our national sample. Oh, sorry, one more national sample result. So one other thing we tested was the county level variation. Because again, we have where people are living in terms, obviously their IP addresses, so we looked at things at the county level. We did look at the voting patterns, and voting patterns did not tell us much, but deindustrialization seems to be related to groupiness. And again, we don't know why. We don't know if it's people are more attached to place. We don't know if people are just, maybe economic circumstances leads to more groupie type behavior. It just hints that these are things that we should be exploring more. A third study I wanted to tell you about. So now that if we think that there's this, groupie type of behavior out there, and it can be particularly destructive. So I showed you those people who are groupie. There's a subset of those that adopt this very destructive behavior. What might change that? So in another set of studies, a group of co-authors and I went back to this minimal groups and political groups together. And within that, there were two treatments. There was a categorical treatment, whereas in addition to the group label, the decision maker was provided with an answer to a survey question. For example, this person was against abortion rights. So something that was related to the category of the party. There was a humanized treatment, whereas in addition to the group label, the decision maker was provided idiosyncratic information, as in, I wanted to be a doctor when I grew up, something that was very personal about the individual. So the groupination looked like this. For example, this is the categorical treatment. I think gay marriage should be legally recognized. as opposed to when I was little, I wanted to be a teacher when I grew up. So each time there was a group label given, as well as either a reinforcing bit of information or an idiosyncratic piece of information. And the main result is that this humanization leads to an increase in allocation to the out group and a decrease in the allocation to the in group. So you can see that by looking here, right? So the in group advantage is falling and the out group disadvantage is disappearing. And so the humanization seems to be breaking this group attachment by providing this idiosyncratic information. And when we look at individual behavior, what I've got here ordered is, first of all, you can see again, we've got a huge diversity, huge heterogeneity in the this is the same in-group measure, in-group favoritism measure I introduced a while back. It's that same measure, and now we've got these are each of these lines is a person, and I'm done. Okay, so I just want to say that providing the categorical information, the humanized information seems to reduce that bias from the initial extremely steep differences, individual differences we see. So I'll stop here. I was going to give a plug for some other folks, but I see there, I can do that in the answers to questions if you need to. And I'm just going to put up my conclusions. Whoops. And I'm happy for questions.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel, for the fascinating talk. So we have 2 questions in the chat. I'm just going to call out people and you can just unmute yourself. So the first question is from Eugen Dimon.
Should I stop sharing my screen so we can all see each other? Would that be more fun?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I think it's more, we have to see people. So
yeah.
Hi, everybody. Okay.
Hey,
right.
Rachel, great talk. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. So I think part of my question you answered in your presentation. I asked how confident you are in the robustness of this groupie and non-groupie type of behavior. So do you think that there are really people who are never groupie, irrespective of whether it's a setting of other versus others, like the original Tashfeld type of allocations, or whether it's self versus others, like like what Yan Chen and others have been doing. So do you actually think that there are just these people that, irrespective of the setting, never express any in-group, out-group differentiation at all?
So well, first of all, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, is that the test that we did is exactly the one that Yan and Sherry did. So we had exactly the same task. So it was money for self and money for somebody in your own group, and money for self and money for somebody in the other group. There was also an own other, you could do it, be the third party there, but that was not I did not present any of those results. That was just to make sure we're all on the same page. In terms of, do I really think, so I don't know. Right. So I'm going to keep going here to try and understand how robust this finding is. That's part of what I want to keep doing. Do I think that there are people out there? I mean, I don't know, but this is what I think I could say. My guess is that these are still very pallid settings. It's still a university lab. It's MTurk. It's, is there somebody out there that I could never get them to act in defense of their group? If you define your group as your family, and is that person not going to defend their family? Probably people will start defending their family. So it becomes about what the definition of this group is and how strongly, I do think the strong identification with the group is somehow still out there. It's just not as out there as I thought it was. And do I think that there are people out there who act in a very sort of group attached way, regardless of the group? Yeah, I think it's just that the people may want to, there are people that might like to be in groups and other people who don't like to be in groups. And that's our political independence that we're seeing. They don't like being in groups. They have the same political opinions, but they don't want to call themselves a Democrat. So that seems to be there. Now, how strong, once we pull at this in these many different directions, right, I'm sure that we're going to tease out much more nuanced behavior. So I guess that's the answer, and it's a lot of work for us to do to see how that plays out.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So the next one is from Johannes Roos.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So it was really nice talk. So I was just wondering, when you were talking a little bit about this finding regarding how quick people made decisions and whether this tells us something about the attention they paid. So there could be 2 ways. of how you could interpret that, right? You could think, well, they didn't pay attention to the group label because they don't care about groups, and that would be good news for your finding. Or it could be they didn't pay attention to the study because they didn't care about the study. And so I was just wondering whether you have any additional evidence that would allow us to distinguish between the two. So one would be if people were generally faster in the experiment because they, they skipped through the instructions, they skipped through all the questions. And
So on that one, I know that they were paying attention because these people were doing remarkably consistent behavior. So I was actually, really concerned when we first set this up. I said, this is a 3-second task. This is a 5-second task. I don't know what we're going to get from this. But what's really striking is how consistent people's behavior was. So the people that I showed you on that graph were actually behaving incredibly consistently. They were basically all those people, whenever the not groupy people there were always choosing the line where it was most money for themselves all the time. And that actually you can do really fast, right? You just look, where'd you go? You're over there. You can just scan and find the money that's highest for you. And the other people, the not groupy people, were doing that all the time when it was somebody outside of their group. When it was somebody inside of the group, they were making a different decision. They were doing inequity aversion or the total income maximizing, and very consistently. So 95% of these subjects were doing something extraordinarily consistent within what's it called, a group condition and a pairing. So political group, in-group, political group, out-group, minimal group, in-group, minimal group, out-group. And we have that from the ex post probabilities.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So one last question. Michael Bauer, so your turn. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Rachel. Hi. Fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. I have a quick note related to Johannes's comment. Maybe the way how you could test his concern is to look at the response time in questions outside of the social dilemma tasks to see whether the non-group individuals are also faster in the other question, and if you would be able to show that the response time difference is specific for the experimental decisions that would favor your interpretation. But I had one more question. I was really struck, and I find really creative your humanizing treatment that I really liked. And also the fact that you find intuitive treatment effect on the effect towards the outgroup. Do you have any speculations? Why do you see that the humanizing treatment reduced altruism towards the in-group? I would be just curious how you think about that. Thanks a lot.
So it's great. Well, that's of course the new finding, right? That is the new finding, is that people are all expecting, and it's been shown that there's a reduction in this bias, and there's less out-group. There's less out-group animosity, or however, all the literature has different words for this. But the fact that it's reducing the favoritism towards the in-group is the new finding. And so, we're relying on the social psychology literature about humanization. So the idea is somehow that you're now not seeing this person as a group. You're now seeing it as only the group label. You're seeing them more as individuals. And so then that's mediating the group attachment, right? So if you see everybody as an individual, then you should be just treating everybody equally. So if there's a weight between group and individual, you've now shifted the weight towards seeing that person as an individual. So it falls a bit, we're sort of inspired by the social psychology literature on humanization and individuation, right? And so that's my best that I have for you. Of course, we really want to get into this a little bit more. I should say one thing that we were very careful with is that we wanted to make sure that those statements that we gave weren't themselves group related. So it wouldn't be, for example, I liked Star Wars or I liked dogs, because that could be, I'm a dog person, I'm a cat person, I'm a Star Wars person, right? So we made sure that all of those questions that we asked were indeed individuating and not somehow symbols of another group. And that's actually a concept that I'm continuing to use in some other work that I'm sort of doing, maybe present in 3 years once we have the data analyzed, where we really are trying to make sure that the questions we're asking people are either group type questions or individuating type questions.
Perfect. Also perfect timing. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you everyone for coming.